spiritual path, and then he closes with a famous text which champions mysticism. But here's the thing. Ghazali, though, is a rather subtle thinker, because he does something that is characteristically medieval in its cultural orientation. He contends that there is a discourse appropriate for the public, the laity, and that discourse should not be speculative. And in discourse, and that the laity, what is appropriate for them is a discourse of traditions and a pietistic discourse. But as to what he says, the khassa, the ulama, he condemns the tendency to this is rather a significant detail. He condemns the tendency to rely on reason, and here's the and he also condemns the tendency to rely on textualism at the expense of spiritualism. Now, in many ways, Ghazali belongs, at least as to the khassa, he belongs to of what we can call in our a philosophical tradition of intuitionism. I mean, he denies that emotions are irrelevant to the identifying of wrong and right. But importantly, he does not, contrary to popular belief, say that the only way you identify wrong and right is by text. He says it is text aided by obvious, what he calls al-ma'qul al-zahir, or what is the apparent rational, what is clear, clearly rational. To reject the illogical impossibilities, and ultimately he says that judgment must integrate our intuitive pietistic sense of God and relationship to God. He in fact has in I wish if this was back at UCLA, I teach a graduate seminar where I bring all these texts and we read through them with the students. So and one of the very beautiful, fascinating passages by Ghazali, in which he condemned, or he sort of sarcastically condemns. There is a lot of sarcasm, a lot of intelligence, the stuffiness of a lot of the textualists or literalists, in that they read the text and end up with the la ma'qul, the irrational, or they end up, as importantly for Ghazali, end up with al-qabih, which is ugly, right? Now, we know that Ibn Rushd later on But Ghazali is not the end of the story. I mean, after Ghazali, we have the appearance of some towering figures like Ibn Aqil. We have Ibn Tufayl. We have, of course, Ibn Rushd, who wrote the Incoherence of the Incoherent. And I would like to pose, though, a more methodological question. A question as to scholarly methodology. When you study intellectual history of the West, or of any tradition, sure, we tend to find figures and after the fact identify these figures as turning points in intellectual history. So for instance, we will say St. Augustine is a turning point, right? Luther, turning point. Calvin, turning point. Now, one of the fascinating issues in historiography is when do they actually become a turning point? It's highly doubtful that if we lived at their time, we would ask them, "Are you a turning point?" They would say, "Yes, I am." You know, and most of those who lived during their time, because of human jealousy, would tend to minimize their importance, right? They say, "Well, what they said, I know, or I said things much more important," stuff like that. But in the discipline of historiography, we try to say, okay, but this person represented a shift, a paradigm shift, and often we try to say, well, perhaps even the paradigm shift was not their actual theory per se, but the communicated reinterpretation of their theory. In other words, not what they actually said, but what people thought they said. That becomes sort of a distilled, symbolic communication that inspires people to do things or not to do things. Now, one of in Western intellectual history, we have numerous texts, numerous influential theorists that raved against the use of reason or deference to reason, and not only that, but the famous institutional history and so on. But we have even well into when Thomas Aquinas was doing his work and sort of engaging Ghazali and Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and siding with one against the other and so on. What he was doing was not free of controversy. It was extremely controversial. I mean, Aquinas' integration and the places of his Summa doesn't. It takes quite a long time before the Summa occupies the intellectual position that it does. I want to pose a follow-up question. As a matter of methodology, how is it that we came to the conclusion that Ghazali killed the spirit of creativity? I know where we all read it, right? We all came to the West, we all read famous German scholars, for the most part, who told us that this is in the same way they told us about the closing of the doors of ijtihad, right? But I've tried to look at, I've read everything they cited and trace the methodology of identifying these turning points. What I find remarkable is how historiography is a very, very active field. I mean, you can hardly pose a historical theory without having 10 people defy you, challenge you, and pose alternative historical theories, right? I mean, to become an eminent historian is one of the hardest things. I think being an eminent jurist is much easier than becoming an eminent historian, because historians are a very contentious bunch, and they have 10 different ways to look at the evidence. But when it comes to Islamic historiography, one of the most remarkable things is how non-contentious the historical narrative is. I mean, how many alternative theories of anything? Gibbs and Watts' famous notion of the Islamic political thought, and the Mawardi's famous compromise about the Khilafah, and then it's all these nicely packaged historical signposts, but where is, and Muslim scholars repeat them, and in fact, they're often, their prestige in secular universities back home is in direct relation to how well they adopt the Western historical narrative. In other words, the most, I'll give you an example. A professor of Sharia at the American University of Cairo, a tenured professor, he told, he had a student who wanted to come study with me, and I was asking him about, her name is Hiba, and asking him about her, and he said, no, don't waste your time with a student. She's a complete waste of time. Why? He said, well, this little, can you believe she wrote, she tried to write her MA on challenging Schacht and Coulson, and I flunked her. Of course, I accepted her at UCLA, and she's actually one of the most brilliant legal historians I've ever met. But the position of this professor, you can go all over the secular universities in Cairo, and you will find that attitude is very, very dominant. The side of my prestige as a professor is that I know what the Western academia says about Islamic history, and the idea of now, the other side of the things, the non-secular academic establishment, when they challenge the Western narrative, it is very rhetorical and childish. It's like saying, it ain't so because it's not fair. It's not particularly compelling for anyone. And we remain locked in this. Now, I raise this question though because one of the most remarkable things is I am am not sure that, in the same way that I'm not sure that the Ash'aris were as influential as we read in quote-unquote orthodox scholarship, I am also not sure that the Mu'tazila became as extinct as we read in mainstream scholarship. Mainstream scholarship tells you the Mu'tazila died, they're gone, khalas, it's over, you know. And I'm not sure that Ghazali was influential among the intellectual elite. He was definitely influential among the Amma, because Ihya Ulumuddin is a very feel-good book. You know, it's like C.S. Lewis in the Christian tradition. You read it, you feel, but if you are, its influence among serious Muslim theologians or even jurists is, now I'll give you an example and then we'll take a break. One of the texts that is very understudied is his book on jurisprudence called Al-Mustasfa. Sorry?
Is it Ghazali?
Al-Mustasfa. Al-Mustasfa by Ghazali. Ghazali wrote Al-Mustasfa. Okay, it's on Usul al-Fiqh. And Al-Mustasfa has an introduction on Husn and Qubh, beauty and ugliness. Now, of course, he doesn't mean, you know, he doesn't mean whether the women outside are beautiful or ugly. It's obvious. He means what? What is he talking about when he says beauty and ugliness? No? Morality. Right? Notions of the ethically right and ethically wrong. Well, in Mustafa, it was one of, when he was younger, and he was a young scholar, he wrote a book on Usul al-Fiqh called Al-Mankhul. You remarkably find very few Muslims, especially, remember yesterday I was talking about affectations of piety? You know, especially the Muslims who engage in the huge affectations of piety, you know, the huge beard, the jalabiya, the spot on their forehead, which, you know, true piety is actually to get cream and sort of make it go away, instead of, you know, instead of display. That's true piety. But you know, you find none of it. It's remarkable how little of the Islamic tradition our Muslim representatives, whoever they are actually read. So he wrote Mankhul when a younger age, and then later on Al-Mustasfa, which is sort of matured theory of Islamic jurisprudence. And the first 100 pages of Al-Mustasfa, he engages in what is without doubt a thoroughly philosophical discussion of the nature of good and evil. And he poses a hypothetical of quite, important hypothetical sort of at the beginning of his discourse, by saying, well, in the realm of in what we can call the purely divine realm, if we see nothing but the divine, if we can imagine hypothetically a place that is occupied by nothing but divinity, the actual sort of embodiment of the divine, would evil exist? Would ugliness exist? What do you think?
The tendency is to say no.
No, right? I mean, that would be the most theologians would say. Now, Ghazali starts out by this and then says, he logics through this by saying that evil cannot be, God cannot create evil. That he uses this paradigm of the space and the absence of evil in space occupied by divine. So, well, that begs the question, well, who then creates evil? And how is God the creator of everything? And if God doesn't, if God, if the text, it's a subtle philosophical point, but bear with me. If the text that addresses law, it's designed to address created things. The text is, as if you will, as an entity, it directs itself at things that are created. Ghazali poses the question of, well, how can this text, which is an entity, a material entity, that exists in the world of the created, manage to address effectively something that is not created by God? It is in other words, can the law, it's as if we put it differently, can the law command, if Satan is the embodiment of evil, can the law command Satan? I won't, if those of you who are really interested can, we'll follow up on that outside. In other words, ask me and I'll be happy to go through the subtle listen. But the point is, as you start saying, wow, this is ethical, philosophical theory. But very interestingly, while Ibn Rushd is very aware of it and he actually responds to it and he disagrees with Ghazali's for all the times that modern Muslims mention Ghazali, I have not met, I can't even count in one hand the number of Muslims who've read the Mustasfa. I know one person, Hassan Barbi, his name is Gamal Badawi. Zaki Badawi. He did his doctorate on he translated the Mustasfa. He's an Egyptian Azharite fellow, but he did his doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania. It was Fazlur Rahman at the University of Chicago. He skipped the whole introduction. He literally just skipped it. So his dissertation starts with the Quran and it's as if Fazlur Rahman, this was shortly before he died, told me that he told him that he felt that if he works with the introduction, he might lose his soul to heretical ideas. Well, chew on that as we take a break. Okay, let's take a 5-10 minute break. Do you guys think it's cold outside?
It might be rainy.
Well, coming from Los Angeles.
Everything seems cold and rainy here, probably.
It's always sunny. I mean, we actually, it's very spoiled, I have to say. And, the way you get over the guilt of having such wonderful weather all the time is...
there are earthquakes.
Yes.
There are earthquakes. I grew up part of the time in Los Angeles, so I'm familiar with the earthquake.